जस्ट पंजाबी देखते हुए सारे व्यूअर्स ਨੂੰ ਮੇਰੇ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਪਿਆਰ ਭਰੀ ਸਤਿ ਸ਼੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ। ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਅੱਜ ਦਾ ਮੁੱਦਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਹੋਸਟ ਆਸ਼ਮਿਤਾ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਸ ਸ਼ਾਮ ਦੇ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇੱਕ ਵਾਰੀ ਫਿਰ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ। ਜਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਮਿਡ ਟਰਮਸ ਆਉਣ ਵਾਲੇ ਹੈ, ਮਿਡ ਟਰਮ ਇਲੈਕਸ਼ਨਸ ਨੂੰ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਸਾਰੇ ਕੈਂਡੀਡੇਟਸ ਤੇ ਪੋਲੀਟੀਕਲ ਇਸ਼ੂਜ਼ ਦੀ ਜਾਣਕਾਰੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਲਗਾਤਾਰ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਸ਼ੇਅਰ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ। ਬਟ ਅੱਜ ਮੈਂ ਥੋੜਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਵੱਖਰਾ ਐਂਗਲ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਡਿਸਕਸ ਕਰਨਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੀ ਹਾਂ। ਜਦੋਂ ਵੀ ਪੋਲੀਟਿਕਸ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ, ਇਲੈਕਸ਼ਨਸ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ, ਇੱਕ ਪੱਖ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਇਲੈਕਟਿਡ ਅਫੀਸ਼ੀਅਲਸ कैंडिडेट्स की रेसिस हो रही हैं, किस स्टेट की किस साइड के नाल ज़्यादा लगाव है, डेमोक्रेट वर्सिस रिपब्लिकन, ये इशूज़ तो आंदे ही है। बट दूजे पक्षों वोटर्स के बारे जानकारी अक्सर नहीं सुनने को मिलती कि वोटर्स की सोच रहे, की महसूस कर रहे, वोटर्स दे नाल पार्टीज़ किस तरह आप दे रिलेशनस बिल्ड कर रही हैं। एंड इन फैक्ट कि जो डेटे की गल आती है, जो असी डेटा नूं वेखते हैं कि साडी कम्यूनिटी दे विच एशियन अमेरिकनस या साउथ एशियन वोटर्स नूं किस तरह हर एक पार्टी अपील करती है, किस इशूज़ दे बलबूते उत्ते वोटर्स आप दे बैलेट्स कैस्ट करते हैं। सो अज मैनूं बहुत खुशी हो रही है कि एक रीसेंट वोटर सर्वे जो कि इस साल कढ़िया गया है, जो कि खास करके एशियन अमेरिकन वोटर्स दे नाल जुड़िया होया है, उहदे बारे जानकारी अज असी तुहाडे नाल शेयर करन जा रहे हैं। इस सर्वे नूं कड्ढण वाली संस्था एशियन एंड पैसिफिक आइलैंडर अमेरिकन वोट APIA vote संस्था the executive director सानू join करे आज शाम दे program दे विच। Please join me in welcoming our guest for this evening, Charistine Chen, executive director of APIA vote. Charistine, welcome to the program. So good to have you.
Thank you so much.
Charistine, first of all, you know, we know this is a really busy time for anyone connected with politics in any way, but you guys, APIA Vote, has been doing a tremendous job, and so we're thankful not just for the work you're doing, but for you taking some time out to connect with our viewers tonight and talk about this work. Before we get started, for those that don't know, I'd love for you to share a brief intro into the organization, right? When we think of Asian Americans, this is such a broad umbrella, but maybe that broad umbrella offers this segment of the population a chance to develop a stronger voting bloc, and this is exactly what you guys have been working on. So why don't you tell us a little bit about APIA Vote and how, you know, the kind of work that you guys have been doing?
Great. Well, thank you. So Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote is the nation's leading nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to promoting and increasing voter participation and civic participation in the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. So that's everyone from the South Asian, East Asian, Southeast Asian, Pacific Islanders, Filipino communities. The way we work is that since 2007, we've been building and working with a nationwide network of community-based organizations. So if you're a nonprofit out there that want to do this work to help build power in our community and to mobilize and empower our communities to essentially contribute to the highest API turnout that we saw in 2020 and moving forward into this midterm elections.
Absolutely. And, you know, you talk about turnout, especially in 2020. Obviously, we have to take the big wins as well as the small ones. It's definitely a big win when in a federal election, this community turns out in great numbers, because we certainly have the numbers, but turnout is sometimes a challenge. But on the other side of that, right, aside from these big, like the presidential election every 4 years, or some of these big races that get a lot of notoriety and mainstream media time, we don't see that much engagement in some of these crucial races, the down ballot races or the local politics that actually determine the day-to-day lives of the community, right? We're talking about this recent survey, the Asian American Voter 2022 survey that was recently conducted, that really lays bare where the work needs to be done, not just from our elected officials and the party's outreach to this community, but maybe for the community itself, you know, in terms of getting involved more. So let's get right to it, right? First of all, we see one of the points that you see in the survey, one of the data points, right, is that Asian Americans are often not contacted in as great numbers as maybe other demographics are by both Republican and Democrats. And I know those numbers vary. So before I kind of get to the importance of engaging with this demographic, give us a little bit more context around this data point.
Right. So, for the longest time, and just in general, campaigns, what they do is typically try to focus on voters that turn out on a regular basis, what we call high propensity voters. So that way they could focus on getting them to just support their candidate or their particular party. But nowadays, the elections are being won by narrow margins. So political parties and campaigns really need to seek out voters that are there that they have not engaged in the past. And we know in 2020, we are one of the fastest growing voting blocks in this country, and also in a number of these battleground states and these congressional races. So when they're looking for new voters that are already registered and looking to actually for more information, they should be really engaging in Asian American and Pacific Islander voters. We know from our survey since 2012 and even most recently that both Democrats and Republicans are still, majority of the Asian American Pacific Islanders are not being contacted by these parties. And so they're missing out in terms of gaining new support when they're not necessarily providing that information to them. We know this for a fact because APIA Vote and our partners in 28 states, we focus on low propensity voters, limited English proficient voters, and first-time voters. And many times, even in 2020, when we sent out mail, called or text, a number of them would say, well, who's on the ballot? You're the first person that's ever contacted us. So we know that they're not doing their job.
It's kind of a vicious cycle, right? Here's an entire contingent of the American population that contributes so much to the civil society here. I mean, at the most basic level, pays its taxes, adds to the fabric of their individual communities, has these strong family values. And they, because of, various reasons, the lack of political participation then makes them kind of a non-factor for these candidates and for these parties. But we have some really unique conditions now that, like you said, are forcing a change in that regard. And maybe this is a perfect opportunity for us to get these voters engaged and finally become a part of this political process. You mentioned this one attribute of these voters being often overlooked. I'd love to just really quickly dive a little deeper into this statistic and this data point. Do you see any variance, Christine, of this data point, since you have kind of surveyed across many states? Do you see any variance where there's higher concentrations of Asian Americans versus where there's lower? I'm just curious because, once again, here in New York, we have a very diverse Asian American community. Folks from various countries and backgrounds are settled here, and they all have their micro voting blocks as well as the larger Asian American community as a whole. Do you see any variance of how parties reach out to these communities in higher density areas versus lower ones?
Right. Well, first of all, we need to start getting our community focusing on voting for every single election, not once every 4 years or once every 2 years. So, I am hopeful because starting in 2018, we saw the increase of the midterm elections and the API community voting. And then it continued on in 2020. And even last year in New Jersey and Virginia, we saw increases of early voting from our community. So heading into the midterm elections, I'm really confident that our communities will be turning out because the conditions and issues that we were facing in 2020, everything from rise of anti-Asian violence, dealing with a pandemic, the economy, healthcare, all these concerns that we had in 2020 are the same ones that we're still facing and that we know are resonating in this Asian American voter survey. In terms of reaching out, whether you're whether you're in an area with a large demographic of the API community or smaller demographics, what we're seeing is that for battleground states and where there's competitive races, that's where the money and more engagement is being dealt with, whether it's nonpartisan as well as with the partisan candidates and political parties. We are also seeing that throughout the last couple of cycles that more Asian American Pacific Islander nonprofits are also looking to organize and work in this area.
Yes.
Whether it is increasing voter registration or also combating dis and misinformation that we're seeing growing rampant, especially in the Indian community on WhatsApp.
Yes. You couldn't have, said it any better. We have like I don't mean to make light of the situation, but a phrase that we often use within South Asians, it's called, don't get your information from WhatsApp or Facebook University, because sometimes people literally take it as doctrine. Oh, I was part of this chain and so-and-so is, some bizarre rumor about a candidate or an issue, and that bizarre rumor really affects how people think and ultimately vote, which is a sad fact of modern technology. But I'm glad to hear that is definitely on the radar of nonprofits such as APIA Vote. You mentioned the issues. I'm so glad you brought it up because that's exactly where I was going with the conversation. Christine, as part of the survey, another data point tells us some of the main issues that voters care about within this demographic, Asian American Pacific Islander. Healthcare coming in as number one, almost 88% folks. And then jobs, economy, 86%, crime and education go from there in the high 80s as well. The point being, if we had to narrow it down, like you said, this community really cares about probably some of the same issues that the rest of the American voter base does. That being said, they probably have different sentiments about which party caters to these issues. Can you share any information about that? As per the results of the survey, who, between Democrat and Republican, the two parties, who do Asian American and Pacific Islanders generally feel caters to these issues more in their favor?
Right. So according to our most recent survey, about 51% of Asian American registered voters survey said that, first of all, that they prefer to cast their ballots by mail or drop-off box. So we also know that they are looking to vote early. And as a result, for those who are voting, Asian American registered voters as a whole were more likely to say that they would vote for a Democratic candidate compared to Republican candidates in the House and Senate elections. Also, specifically among Indian Americans, they were most likely to say that they would vote for Democratic candidates in comparison to other Asian ethnic communities. Since we're also talking about the issues, I also wanted to flag that there were a number of issues where Indian Americans actually noted that gun control was actually, they noted gun control as a higher issue than many of the other ethnicities. 79% of Indian Americans saw gun control as at least very important, and 80% saw environment as at least very important as well. So these are also issues that candidates also need to engage the Indian American community when talking about gaining their trust and gaining their vote.
Once again, I'm glad you're sharing this information because this is, I think, especially valuable in some of those swing states that ultimately decide these big elections, right? And, we always say big elections, but even this year with the midterms, all of the eyes, whether you're a political pundit, a party strategist, a member of the media, or just an average American, all eyes are on states like Arizona, and the like, Pennsylvania, et cetera, to see, which way they will turn a tide and affect the makeup of our government. And some of these issues are key in these states where, like you said, voters are being aggressively courted by all parties and candidates right now. How does hate crime and hate crimes in general factor into all of this? Because we know this is an area that Asian Americans, whether they're, Chinese, Korean, Filipino, or Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Pacific Islander, we've seen either a historical trend of discrimination, hate crimes, bullying, or a more recent trend in the COVID and post-COVID era of just violence against Asians. How do hate crimes factor in? And once again, how do you see the parties and candidates addressing these issues with this demographic?
Right. So, once again, what we need to do is really connect the dots for our community, because we know hate crimes and crime in general is also on top of mind of these households, but also connect the dots like, okay, when we're saying what is the long-term solution for hate crimes, it really is about changing the curriculum and inclusion of Asian American and ethnic studies in K through 12. Well, who actually makes those kind of decisions? Well, that actually is school board. And to be able to influence school board members, we need to be voters. Or for us to get more federal funding for education, right? Or to actually have more resources for mental health and other programs that we need in our communities to really have a cohesive manner to addressing the rise of anti-Asian violence as well as crime overall. So these are all the different connections that we need to start having with our family and friends. And also, once again, going back to our survey, we know that the most trusted messenger is actually your friends. Friends talking to other friends about why they're voting in this particular election, how they're actually making their plan to vote, because we know in certain states like Georgia and Texas and some other ones, they're actually making it harder to vote. So we need to also retrain our electorate in terms of trying to figure out what's the best way for them to cast their vote and make sure it gets counted. But it's really about those kind of conversations that need to be had with family and friends starting now. So that way they already know by November that before then they actually have to cast their ballot.
It's so important to have a plan, right? There was a time in previous election cycles that the big message was get out the vote. This year, you're seeing a lot of messaging around plan your vote because of exactly that reason, that there are efforts underway in so many states to not just discredit certain voters, but overall just make it harder, whether it's via early voting, mail-in ballots, or things like, an old address being on your voting registration that will disqualify your ballot. Something as simple as that can take away your most essential right in this country. Christine, I love the fact that you kind of brought into the conversation the importance of some of these local elections, the local politics, or even, being involved in things like your local school board, which is so important for minorities in general, communities of color, because that's really where the messaging starts, the change that we can bring about starts, right? I'd love for you to, give your take on the importance of local elections before we get to the larger call to action, regarding all elections and participation in general. Why is it so important for folks to know who their local city council, school board member is, and then maybe ultimately, go for those seats themselves and be physically hands-on involved in some of these decisions?
Well, I think this pandemic time period has really shown us the importance of local elected officials or boards and commissions, because we're tuning in every day to try to figure out what decisions being made. Can, I open up my business? What protocols do I need to follow to remain safe? is the school going to go ahead and open? These are all decisions being made by local elected officials and school board members and boards and commissions. And so when we're seeing that the API community has doubled doubled their population since 2010 to 2020. Actually, 49 out of 50 states, we've doubled and increased our population. So we know in those areas, that means there's going to be a larger electorate as well. And because of this population growth, we need to make sure that our concerns and our needs within our community are also being met. Whether it's making sure there are services for limited English proficient communities, or working in coalition with other communities of color and other allied groups to making sure that we're actually represented fairly and that the elections are accessible to us. There's just so many issues that we could be connecting the dots to the everyday household. We also know that as we head into this midterm election, that once again, it's so important for us to really educate. I really want to emphasize to everyone that we really need to talk to our family and friends and educate them about the process to vote. Yes. And really help them figure out what is on the ballot. The other reason is because with redistricting, yes, you may have thought that you, in the past in 2020, you were situated in a certain member of Congress or a certain district. Well, because of lines being redrawn, that candidate may no longer be your candidate and right on your ballot. So we need to re-educate ourselves also about, what is on the ballot, who are the actual candidates, and really start participating in discussions with these candidates and political parties to figure out who could best serve your family as we head into the next 10 years.
Christine, the way I'm hearing it is you're saying that it's one thing to hold accountable our elected officials and the candidates running for those seats up and down the ballot, but the work really starts at home. It starts with the individual themselves, that we need to first educate and hold ourselves accountable on our knowledge of the process and our participation or engagement with the political process before we then say, hey, this guy, I voted for him, but he's not really working for me after all. I really appreciate your time and once again the work that you're doing. Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote Organization, as Executive Director, we thank you for this survey that gives us so many interesting data points to learn from your Asian American voter survey for this year. Christine, once again, thank you so much, and we wish you and your organization the best of luck in the work that you continue to do, and of course our collective communities going into yet another interesting election cycle. Have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you so much. And be sure to check out our website for additional resources for each and every one of you.
Once again, that website is on the screen, www.apiavote.org. Christine Chen, thank you so much.